Hey everybody, tonight's video is called Burdens Against Babylon, Edom, and Assyria. And tonight we continue our pass-through study here in the book of Isaiah. We're going to be looking at 3 burdens announced in this short chapter. So tonight's chapter is only 17 verses, so it's going to be not a short video, not a really long video, but somewhere in the middle. So start with Isaiah chapter 21, verse 1 and 2. It says, "The burden against the wilderness of the sea, as whirlwinds in the south pass through. So it comes from the desert, from a terrible land. A distressing vision is declared to me. The treacherous dealer deals treacherously, and the plunderer plunders. Go up, O Elam, besiege, O Media, all its Satans I have made to cease." So wilderness of the sea is southern Babylon near the Persian Gulf, that's also known for its fertility. And as whirlwinds in the south, it refers to a simile drawn from the suddenness of which the storm winds come from the Negev, and it swept through the land of Israel. And so sudden is to be Babylon's overthrow. And the Elamites and Medes were part of the Persian army that defeated Babylon in 539 BC. And we see that Isaiah is found overwhelmed with the vision that he has. He feels overwhelmed by what he's seeing. In verse 3 through 10, it says, "Therefore, my loins are filled with pain. Pangs have taken hold of me, like the pangs of a woman in labor. I was distressed when I heard it. I was dismayed when I saw it. My heart wavered. Fearfulness frightened me. The night for which I longed, he turned into fear for me. Prepare the table, set a watchman in the tower. Eat and drink, arise, you princes. Anoint the shield. For thus has the Lord said to me, go set a watchman, let him declare what he sees. And he saw a chariot with a pair of horsemen, a chariot of donkeys and a chariot of camels. And he listened earnestly with great care. And he cried, O a lion, my Lord, I stand continually on the watchtower in the daytime. I have sat at my post every night, and look, here comes a chariot of men with a pair of horsemen. Then he answered and said, Babylon has fallen, Babylon is fallen. All the carved images of her gods he has broken to the ground. O my threshing and the grain of my floor, that which I have heard from the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, I have declared to you." So the severity of the violence about which Isaiah must prophesy caused him extreme agitation. And you might ask why, and I'm glad you asked. And with Babylon's fall, no one can rescue Judah from Assyria. And the image of a woman in labor we see is very common in the prophets for, like a metaphor for extreme pain and anguish. And any mother would know exactly what this is speaking about. In verse 5, recalls Belshazzar's feast in Daniel chapter 5, when a mid-celebration came to call to fight the attacking enemy army invading the city. And as I mentioned a few times in our study through Isaiah, my friend Brian Peckham is doing a study through the book of Daniel. And if you want to, study Daniel with him, go right ahead. He posts it right on his page. And oil the shield in verse 5, it means to prepare for battle. And then in verse 6, we see set a watchman. And Isaiah stationed a watchman on the city walls. And God's watchman in Judah is Isaiah. In verse 7, Isaiah heard the watchman warn of the approaching military force. In verse 8, he cried, a lion, my Lord. The Dead Sea Scroll correctly read, the watchman cried, my Lord. And the watchman whom Isaiah had stationed continued his report. In verse 9, the watchman proclaimed the tragic end of mighty Babylon, which initially fell to the Assyrians in 689 BC and again to the Persians in 539 BC, for you history lovers like myself. Yet Isaiah's prediction looked forward to the ultimate fall of the great enemy of God, as verified by the Apostle John later in the book of Revelation. And in verse 10, my threshing and the grain on my floor, we see a violent threshing of grain portrayed Babylon's oppression of Israel, and the resultant grain was Israel's deliverance by God. And the concise saying offered God's people hope. In verse 11 and 12, it says, the burden against Duma, he calls to me out of Seir. Watchman, what of the night? Watchman, what of the night? The watchman said, the morning comes and also the night. If you inquire, return, come back. So I just want to make a mention here. In verse 11, we see Duma, and Duma is actually the Oasis in northern Arabia, approximately 300 miles south of Jerusalem. And Seir is another name for Edom, located south of the Dead Sea and the home of Esau's descendants. And this is the source of an inquiry directed to Isaiah. What of the night? And how long was the Assyrian oppression to last? And in verse 12, the prophet promises a short-lived deliverance from the Assyrian oppression, but quickly added the threat of Babylonian domination to follow soon. In verse 13 through 17, we see a proclamation moves on to Arabia. And I know in my title I said Assyria. It's Arabia here. The burden against Arabia. In the forest of Arabia you will lodge. O you traveling companies of Dedanites, O inhabitants of the land of Tema, bring water to him who is thirsty. With their bread they met him who fled. For they fled from the swords, from the drawn sword, from the bent bow, and from the distress of war. For thus the Lord said to me, within a year, according to the year of a hired man, all the glory of Kedar will fail, and the remainder of the number of archers, the mighty men of the people of Kedar, will be diminished. For the Lord God of Israel has spoken it. So forest refers to scrub bush, as Arabia has few or no forests. And the Dedanites were from Dedan, approximately 290 miles southeast of Duma, in the northwestern part of the Arabian desert. In verse 14, Tema is approximately 200 miles southeast of Duma in the northwestern part of the Arabian desert. And the prophet indicated that those fleeing the Assyrian army will need supplies. In verse 15, the interior area of Arabia was the place of refuge for fugitives fleeing from the sophisticated ornament of the Assyrians. In verse 16, Kedar covers the area northwestern part of the Arabian desert. And glory of Kedar will fail, prophecy anticipated. Glory of Kedar will fail, as prophecy anticipated, the conquest of the region by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, as we'll also see at the end of the year when we study the book of Jeremiah, chapter 49, verse 28. So for a wrap up for tonight, we see listed out the burden against Babylon as an army from Persia marches on to Babylon. And we see the fall of Babylon later in the New Testament, as well as we saw today in chapter 21, verse 3 through 10. And I want to go over to the book of Revelation, chapter 18, verse 2. It says here, and he cried mightily with a loud voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, and has become a dwelling place of demons, a prison for every foul spirit and a cage for every unclean and hated bird. So we see in Revelation 18:2 the cry of the angel when God judges the world system, both commercial and spiritual Babylon. And the repetition of the phrase is fallen connects with the two passages. And Revelation 18 verse 9 says, the kings of the earth who committed fornication and live luxuriously with her will weep and lament for her when they see the smoke of her burning. In Revelation 18 verse 20, rejoice over her, O heaven, and you holy apostles and prophets, for God has avenged you on her. So when the Lord strikes the world system, both spiritual and commercial Babylon, the world will be terrified, and they're going to mourn the same way as the people did of Babylon, who had panic and terror felt when that great city was conquered by the Medes and the Persians. And God's people, though, rejoice over the fall of Babylon. And verse 11 and 12 showed us the burden against Edom, also known as Duma in the text. And we see the chapter ends with the burden against Arabia. So I hope you have a great rest of your evening. We'll be back tomorrow as we're going to look at chapter 22 on the judgment of Jerusalem. So have a great weekend up ahead. I hope that you join back in tomorrow. Right around 3 p.m. is the plan. But I just hope that you have, a relaxing weekend as well. And we'll see you next.